I came back to my ranch early from a trip, and the first thing I see is the HOA Karen on the phone, calling 911 on me. She stood in my own driveway, yelling, "Trespasser!" as if I were a criminal. When the sheriff showed up, she waved around a fake emergency occupancy order, claiming my property wasn't mine anymore. But that wasn't even the craziest part. When I finally got to my houseboat, I heard a TV playing inside. She hadn't just trespassed on my ranch. She'd been living in my houseboat for 2 weeks. What do you do when someone has not only taken over your home, but has also created forged documents to make it look legal? Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, because this story of kicking out a squatter is just getting started. The dust from the gravel road felt good under my truck's tires. It had been 3 long weeks away on a consulting job, a project that ended ahead of schedule, and all I could think about was a quiet weekend at the ranch. It was just after 11:30 a.m. on a Thursday, and the sun was high over the lake. I had this picture in my head, opening up the houseboat, grabbing a cold drink from the fridge, and just sitting on the deck watching the water. The ranch was my sanctuary, the one place on earth that felt completely mine. It was handed down from my father, and every inch of it, from the old oak tree at the gate to the boat slip my dad and I built back in the 80s, was filled with memories. My plan was simple: get in, unpack, and unwind. But as I made the final turn onto my private driveway, that plan evaporated. Standing right in the middle of the gravel path, with her back to me, was Karen Whitmore, the HOA president. She had a phone pressed to her ear and was practically yelling into it. My first thought was that maybe a tree was down, or there was some other issue she was handling. I slowed the truck to a stop about 20 feet behind her, not wanting to startle her. That's when I caught the words that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Yes, a trespasser on private property," she screeched. "He just drove right through the main gate. I'm the president of the Homeowners Association, and I need an officer here immediately." It took a second for my brain to catch up. I looked around. There was no one else here. The road was empty. The gate she was talking about was my gate. A slow, cold realization washed over me. She was calling the cops on me for driving onto my own ranch. I put the truck in park and killed the engine, the sudden silence making her voice even louder. She was a piece of work, this one. I'd only had a few run-ins with her since she got elected president last year, mostly about the length of the grass near the road. But this was a whole new level. My property, all 60 acres of it, including the lake access and the houseboat, was never part of the HOA. My father had bought the land and built the house long before the subdivision next door even existed. He'd made sure the legal paperwork was ironclad. We weren't members, we didn't pay dues, and we didn't have to follow their rules. Everyone knew it. But Karen operated in her own reality, one where her authority had no borders. I sat there and waited. Getting out and yelling would only make me look like the aggressor she was painting me to be. 10 minutes later, a county sheriff's vehicle crunched up the driveway and parked behind my truck. Deputy Mark Torres got out. I knew him, not well, but we'd volunteered on a couple of community cleanup projects together. He was a straight shooter, a guy who did things by the book. He nodded at me, his face unreadable, and then walked up to Karen, who had ended her call and was now standing with her arms crossed, radiating smugness. "He just showed up, Deputy," she said, pointing at me. "This area is under emergency management by the HOA. He has no right to be here." Deputy Torres looked from her to me. I got out of my truck, keeping my hands visible and moving slowly. "Morning, Mark," I said calmly. "This is my property. I just got back in town." Karen scoffed. "Not anymore, it's not. It's community property now." This was the moment she'd clearly been waiting for. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her oversized purse and waved it like a winning lottery ticket. "I have the official order right here," she declared. "A temporary HOA occupancy order, signed and filed." Deputy Torres took the paper from her and started reading. I walked back to my truck, opened the glove compartment, and pulled out my own piece of paper, a folded certified copy of the property deed. I always kept one in the truck, a lesson my father taught me. "Proof over arguments," he used to say. I walked back and handed the deed to the deputy. Here's the deed, Mark. The parcel number is on the top right. My family has owned it since 1978. Deputy Torres held the two documents side by side. Karen stood there, beaming, as if her flimsy piece of paper could somehow invalidate a legal deed recorded with the county for over 40 years. But I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at the order in the deputy's hand. From where I stood, I could see the details, and my stomach tightened, not with fear, but with a cold, clear anger. The first thing I noticed was the date. The order was dated yesterday. How could they issue an emergency order for a property they hadn't even inspected? Then I saw the seal. It was supposed to be an embossed seal from the county clerk's office, the kind that leaves a raised impression on the paper. This one was flat, a little blurry, like it had been printed from a low-resolution JPEG. It was a fake, but the knockout punch was the parcel number. I knew my number by heart. The number on her official order wasn't even close. It belonged to a small patch of undeveloped community land 2 miles down the road. Her entire claim was based on a forgery, and a sloppy one at that. Deputy Torres looked up, his eyes meeting mine. I could see he spotted the problems too. He handed the fake order back to Karen. "Ma'am, these parcel numbers don't match." Karen's smile faltered for a split second. "It's a typo," she snapped back. "A clerical error. The intent is clear. This property is under our management." Mark sighed, the sound of a man who knew he was caught in the middle of a civil mess. He handed my deed back to me. "Look," he said, addressing us both. "This is a property dispute. It's a civil matter, not a criminal one. I can't arrest a man who has a deed to the property he's on. And I can't force you to leave, ma'am. You two or the HOA board are going to have to sort this out." He gave me a look that said, "Sorry, but my hands are tied," and got back in his car. As he drove away, Karen shot me a look of pure venom. "This isn't over," she hissed, before turning on her heel and marching off down the road toward the main subdivision. I stood there for a long moment, the deed still in my hand. Part of me wanted to just go home and lock the door, but the real heart of the ranch, my personal escape, was the houseboat. I needed to see it, to make sure everything was okay. I drove my truck down the private lane to the dock, parked, and walked toward the water. The old wooden boards of the dock felt solid under my boots. The boat looked fine, sitting there peacefully in its slip. I pulled out my keys, found the one for the boathouse's main door, and slid it into the lock. It turned smoothly. I pushed the door open, expecting silence, maybe the faint smell of lake water and old wood. Instead, my ears were hit with the sound of a television. It was on, inside my houseboat. A talk show, by the sound of it, the canned laughter echoing in the sudden, terrifying quiet of my own mind. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a paperwork attack. Karen wasn't just trying to bully me. Someone was inside my home. My hand froze on the doorknob. The sound was unmistakable, the cheerful, empty chatter of a daytime TV host coming from the main cabin. For a moment, my mind refused to process it. Maybe I'd left it on 3 weeks ago? Impossible. I never watched that stuff, and I'm meticulous about shutting everything down before a trip. My training as an engineer, and maybe just my father's voice in my head, makes me double-check every switch and lock. With my heart pounding a steady, heavy rhythm against my ribs, I pushed the door fully open and stepped inside. The air was stale, not with the familiar scent of wood and lake water, but with the cheap, floral scent of an air freshener. And right there, sitting on the small entryway table where I usually drop my keys, was a woman's purse. It was a big, expensive-looking thing, not my style at all. Next to it was a laundry basket, overflowing with clothes. A few steps further in, by the spiral staircase leading up to the sleeping loft, sat an open suitcase, a pink blouse draped over the side. The television was on, just as I'd heard, playing to an empty room. Someone wasn't just here. They had moved in. I pulled out my phone and took a picture of the purse and the laundry. I made sure the timestamp was visible on the screen. Then another of the suitcase. I did it slowly, methodically, just like I was documenting a structural fault on a job site. My anger was there, a hot coil in my gut. But the need for proof was stronger. Emotion clouds judgment, evidence wins arguments. I moved up the narrow staircase. The scene in the loft cabin was even worse. The bed, my bed, was unmade, the sheets thrown back in a messy heap. On the nightstand was a half-empty glass of water and a paperback novel with a dog-eared page. I opened the small fridge. My neat rows of bottled water and a couple of beers were gone. In their place were cartons of yogurt, a bottle of white wine, and a container of wilted salad greens. It was a complete violation, an occupation. Then I saw it. Leaning in the corner, next to the bookshelf my dad had built, were two high-end fishing poles. They weren't mine. I recognized them instantly. They belonged to Pete Lawson and Rick Taylor, two of Karen's closest allies on the HOA board. They'd bragged about them at the last town cookout. This wasn't just Karen's little secret vacation. She'd brought friends. The conspiracy was wider than I thought. I went back downstairs, my mind racing. I needed to know how long. How did they get in? As I stepped back out onto the dock, my dockside neighbor, Earl Jensen, was there, pretending to check the ropes on his own boat. Earl's a retired electrician, lived on the lake his whole life. He's a quiet guy, keeps to himself, but he doesn't miss a thing. He glanced over at my open door, then at me, his eyes telling me he already knew. He shuffled over, keeping his voice low. "They've been living in there, Jack," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Started almost as soon as you left for your trip." He told me the story. About 3 days after I'd gone, Karen, Pete, and Rick had shown up on the dock with clipboards. Karen had announced to anyone who would listen that there had been a severe storm warning, and the HOA needed to conduct an emergency structural inspection on all lakeside properties for safety reasons. It was a complete lie. The weather had been clear for weeks, but it was their cover. Under the guise of an official inspection, they'd gained access. Earl had watched them from his window. He'd thought it was suspicious, so he'd pointed his own dockside security camera, one of those simple, motion-activated ones more, toward my slip. He said they used a key to get in, which meant Karen must have had a copy made somehow, or worse, had one all along. "I've got the footage for you," Earl said, pulling a small USB drive from his pocket and pressing it into my hand. "It shows them moving their stuff in that first night. Wine cases, fishing gear, the whole lot." I felt a small glimmer of hope. This was it. Forged documents, trespassing, and now video evidence of them moving in for a secret vacation on my property. They were caught. I spent the next hour inside my own houseboat, which now felt like a crime scene, taking pictures of everything. I documented the food in the fridge, the clothes in the drawers, the toiletries in the bathroom. Every photo was a piece of the puzzle, a nail for their coffin. I copied the files from Earl's USB drive onto my laptop, my hands shaking slightly. The video was exactly as he'd described. Karen, Pete, and Rick laughing as they carried luggage onto my boat in the dead of night, clearly visible under the dock lights. It was undeniable proof. I felt a surge of confidence. This would be over quickly. A call to Deputy Torres, show him this evidence, and they'd be escorted out in disgrace. That evening, I drove my truck back up to the main ranch house, leaving the houseboat as they'd left it. I wanted the evidence to be undisturbed. I planned to call the sheriff's office first thing in the morning. But my brief sense of victory was short-lived. Just as the sun was setting, I walked back down to the boat for one last look. And there, stuck to the boat's windshield with a piece of tape, was a bright orange piece of paper. It was an official HOA notice of non-compliance. My eyes scanned the text, my blood running cold. It claimed I was in violation for unauthorized vessel docking in an HOA-controlled slip. At the bottom was the penalty, a fine of $7,500, due within 14 days. My houseboat, my slip, on my land. They were fining me for parking my own boat at my own dock. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't a greedy impulse to get a free vacation. This was targeted. This was a deliberate, calculated attack designed to strip me of my property. The fake order, the trespassing, and now this impossible finite was all part of a plan to force me out, to break me, and to steal what was mine. My hope turned to steel. This was no longer a dispute, it was a war, and I was going to finish it. The fluorescent glow of my laptop screen cut through the pre-dawn darkness of my kitchen. The ranch house was silent, but my mind was a whirlwind of calculated anger. Spread out across the old oak table my father had built was the beginning of my arsenal. On the left, a neat stack of printouts, the time-stamped photos from inside my houseboat, Karen's purse on the table, her laundry by the stairs, the half-eaten salad in my fridge. Next to them was the video file from Earl's dockside camera, paused on a crystal-clear image of Pete and Rick hauling cases of wine onto my deck. In the center, I placed the two key documents side by side, my ironclad, county-certified deed, and Karen's flimsy, fake occupancy order. To the right, all by itself, was the absurd, bright orange notice of noncompliance, demanding $7,500 for the crime of docking my own boat in my own slip. I wasn't just going to fight this. I was going to dismantle it, piece by piece, with undeniable proof. My first move wasn't going to be another call to the sheriff. It was going to be a trip to the one place where facts are sacred, the county clerk's office. I was there at 8:30 a.m. sharp, the first person through the doors when they opened. The building smelled of old paper and quiet efficiency. I walked up to the public records counter and met Susan McKay. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp eyes and an organized desk, the kind of person who finds comfort in rules and proper procedure. I calmly explained my situation, leaving out the emotion and sticking to the facts. I told her I'd been presented with an order regarding my property, and I just wanted to verify its authenticity. I handed her the document Karen had brandished so proudly in my driveway. Susan took it without a word and examined it. She didn't need a magnifying glass. Her finger traced the blurry printed seal in the bottom corner. "Well, that's not right," she said, her voice flat. "Our county seal is embossed. You can feel it with your thumb. This one is a picture." She turned to her computer terminal, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She typed in the reference number printed at the top of Karen's order. A few seconds later, she shook her head. "There is no record of this document in our system. It has never been filed, never been recorded, and never been issued by any department in this building." She then took my deed, typed in my parcel number, and my property details immediately flashed up on her screen. "This," she said, pointing to my deed, "is real. That," she added, pushing the fake order back across the counter to me, "is a piece of paper pretending to be official." To leave no room for doubt, she called over a gentleman from the property assessor's office. "Tom, can you look at this parcel number for me?" she asked, pointing to the number on Karen's fake order. Tom, a man with a friendly, weathered face, peered at it for a moment. "That's easy, Susan," he said with a little chuckle. "That's parcel 7B, 113. It's a 5-foot wide drainage easement over by the highway. It's not even big enough to park a car on, let alone a houseboat." He then looked at my real parcel number on the deed. "Now this one," he said, tapping my document, "is a 60-acre waterfront property. They aren't in the same universe. A parcel number is like a fingerprint for land. No two are the same. Whoever typed this up didn't just make a typo. They grabbed a random number out of thin air. This was it. The expert confirmation. The fraud wasn't just a suspicion anymore. It was a documented fact, confirmed by the very office Karen was pretending to represent. I thanked them both, my voice steady despite the surge of vindication I felt. I had my first official piece of ammunition. That afternoon, back at the ranch, I sat down and composed an email. I sent it to the official address for the HOA Board of Directors, making sure to copy Karen's personal HOA email address as well. The subject line was simple: "Immediate rectification required for property at my address." The body of the email was professional, polite, but firm. I stated that I was the legal owner of the property, citing my deed and parcel number. I informed them that the temporary HOA occupancy order was a fraudulent document, as confirmed by the county clerk's office, and that I considered any attempt to enforce it as a criminal act. I then made 3 clear demands. First, the immediate and permanent removal of the baseless $7,500 fine for unauthorized vessel docking. Second, the immediate return of any and all keys to my houseboat and property that are in the possession of any HOA member or representative. And third, a full, unedited digital copy of the current HOA bylaws, which you claim grant you authority over my private non-member property. I finished the email by stating I expected a reply and full compliance within 24 hours, or I would be forced to pursue all available legal remedies. Then I hit send and sat back, the ball now firmly in their court. The reply came faster than I expected, just 2 hours later. It wasn't a capitulation. It wasn't an apology. It was a declaration of war. The email was short, cold, and dripping with condescending authority. It read, "Mr. Rowan, your email has been received, and its contents noted. Be advised, your occupancy rights and access to the dock and vessel in question are suspended pending a full investigation by the HOA board into your non-compliance with community regulations. Any attempt to access the slip or houseboat will be considered a violation of this suspension. We will inform you of the board's final decision in due course." I read it twice, then a third time. They were doubling down. They were ignoring the evidence of their fraud and inventing a new rule, a suspension, on the spot to keep me away from my home. The frustration was a physical weight. How do you reason with people who simply invent their own reality? Just as I was about to spiral into pure anger, I heard a quiet knock on my kitchen door. It was Earl, my neighbor. He didn't say much, just stood there in his worn-out work jacket. He held out another USB drive. "This is from the main security camera at the community marina entrance," he said, his voice low. "It covers the whole dock area from a distance." I checked the timestamps. "You're going to want to see the footage from the exact day and time they sent out that fake storm damage notice to the whole neighborhood." He pressed the small plastic drive into my palm. It felt heavy, like it contained the next chapter of this fight. I now had another piece of the puzzle, another secret tape waiting to be seen. I slid the USB drive from Earl into my laptop, the small plastic rectangle feeling impossibly heavy. Outside, the night was quiet, but inside the ranch house, the air crackled with anticipation. I clicked on the single video file, and my screen filled with a familiar, wide-angle view of the community marina and the docks. The timestamp in the corner read 10:17 p.m., dated exactly 3 days after I had left for my trip. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, 3 figures walked into frame, emerging from the direction of the HOA clubhouse. It was Karen, flanked by her 2 loyalists, Pete Lawson and Rick Taylor. Karen was holding a clipboard, holding it up like it was a shield of authority. Pete and Rick were carrying my fishing gear, the expensive rods I'd just seen in my cabin, and 2 large cases of what looked like wine. As they approached the locked gate leading to my private dock, they paused. Pete put the gear down and looked around, a little nervous, but Karen just laughed, patted his shoulder, and pulled a key from her pocket. The camera was too far away to see the key clearly, but it didn't matter. The action was unmistakable. They unlocked the gate to my private slip, the one I had installed a heavy-duty, tamper-resistant lock on years ago, and walked right through. They moved with an air of entitlement, like they were attending a party they had planned for weeks. The footage was damning. They weren't conducting a storm damage inspection. They were stalking a secret vacation house. And the timestamp was the final nail in the coffin. I pulled up the email alert the HOA had sent to all residents about the emergency inspections. It had been sent at 4:30 p.m. on the very same day. They had created their paper-thin excuse in the afternoon to justify their criminal trespass that night. The lie and the act were now tied together with a digital rope. But one question still bothered me. The gate lock. I was certain it was a high-security model that couldn't be easily picked or duplicated at a local hardware store. I called Earl. He was over in 5 minutes. I showed him the footage, and he just nodded grimly. We walked down to the dock in the dark, our flashlights cutting beams through the night air. Earl knelt by the gate lock and ran his flashlight over it. "Well, there's your answer, Jack," he said, pointing with a thick, calloused finger. "This ain't your lock." He explained that my lock was a Medico, a brand known for being nearly impossible to duplicate without a special card. The lock on the gate now was a cheap, generic brand you could buy for $10. "See these scratch marks around the housing?" he said, tracing them. "They used a wrench to tear the old one off, then just screwed this piece of junk in its place. Amateurs. But it worked. They hadn't picked the lock. They had destroyed and replaced it. This was another layer of their plan, another calculated crime. The cost of the lock was nothing, but the act itself showed clear intent. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. This was a planned seizure of my property. I felt a cold surge of certainty. I had them. The next morning, I compiled everything into a single, organized folder on my computer. I wrote a calm, factual email to Deputy Mark Torres, the officer who had responded to the initial 911 call. I attached the forged HOA order, the photos from inside the houseboat, the video of them moving in, and a close-up photo of the broken and replaced lock. I summarized the events in a clear timeline, complete with dates and timestamps. I ended the email by saying, "This appears to be a clear case of fraud, trespassing, and destruction of property. I am requesting the Sheriff's Department open a formal investigation." I sent it off and waited, feeling that the weight of the evidence was now so overwhelming that it could only lead to one outcome. Deputy Torres called me back that afternoon. His tone was professional, but I could hear a hint of frustration in his voice. "I got your email, Jack, and you're right. That video of them entering your houseboat after creating a false pretense, that's unauthorized entry. Plain and simple." A wave of relief washed over me. "So, you'll be arresting them?" I asked. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "It's not that simple," he said, and my relief evaporated. "I can write up a report, and I will, but I've seen these before. I can almost guarantee you the district attorney's office will look at this and call it a civil matter. They'll say it's an internal HOA dispute, not a criminal case they want to spend resources on. They've got a high bar for this stuff." The hope that had been building inside me crumbled. The system I trusted was about to shrug its shoulders. Then Torres offered a small lifeline. "Look," he said, "don't give up. You have a rock-solid civil case. You should file in small claims court for the damages and file a separate civil fraud complaint. You have more than enough evidence to win there. The burden of proof is lower than in a criminal trial." It wasn't the swift justice I had hoped for, but it was a path, a plan. It was something. I thanked him and hung up, my mind already shifting gears towards civil court filings. The next morning, I woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. I sat at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, ready to start drafting the paperwork for small claims court. Just as I started writing, there was a sharp, official-sounding knock on my front door. It wasn't Earl. It was a uniformed process server. He asked if I was Jack Rowan, and when I confirmed, he handed me a thick envelope and left without another word. I stood in my doorway and tore it open. My hands started to shake as I read the first page. It was a temporary restraining order. Karen Whitmore had filed it against me. The document was filled with lies, claiming I had been seen lurking on the dock, that I had verbally threatened her at my gate, and that she was now in fear for her safety. She was twisting my own attempt to reclaim my property into an act of aggression, and the order was brutally effective. It legally prohibited me from coming within 100 yards of the dock, the houseboat, and Karen herself. With a single perjured document, she had legally barred me from my own home. I was locked out. The fight had just entered a dark, new phase. The coffee was still hot in my mug when the sharp, formal knock landed on my front door. It wasn't the friendly tap of a neighbor. It was the sound of official business. I opened it to find a man I'd never seen before, dressed in a cheap suit, holding a thick manila envelope. "Are you Jack Rowan?" he asked, his voice bored. I said yes, and he pushed the envelope into my hands. "You've been served," he mumbled, turning and walking back to his car without another word. I stood there in the doorway, the warm morning air suddenly feeling cold. I tore open the envelope. The words on the top of the first page leaped out at me. Temporary restraining order. It was filed by Karen Whitmore. My hands began to tremble, not with fear, but with a deep, volcanic anger. The document was a work of pure fiction. It claimed that I had been stalking her at the dock, that I had shouted verbal threats at her during our encounter at the gate, and that she was now living in constant fear for her safety. She was twisting my attempts to defend my own property into acts of harassment. With a few calculated lies on a sworn statement, she had weaponized the court system against me. The order was brutally clear. I was legally forbidden from coming within 100 yards of her, the dock, or the houseboat. A hearing was scheduled in 14 days to determine if the order should be made permanent. 14 days. She hadn't just gotten a court order. She had bought herself 2 more weeks of free vacation in my home. For a moment I just stood there, the papers shaking in my hand. It was a brilliant, evil move. She knew the sheriff couldn't help me without a clear criminal case, so she'd sidestepped him entirely and gone straight to a judge, painting herself as the victim. My evidence, the forged order, the video footage meant nothing against a sworn declaration of fear, at least not at first. My first call was to my old friend, Hank Dorsey. Hank's a retired police sergeant, a gruff but fiercely loyal man who has seen every trick in the book. I explained the situation, and he let out a short, bitter laugh. "She's playing the system, Jack," he said, his voice gravelly over the phone. "It's the oldest move in the book for people like her. Getting a temporary restraining order is easy. All you have to do is claim you're scared. A judge will almost always sign it first and ask questions later. They'd rather be safe than sorry. The burden is now completely on you to prove she's lying." He explained that the system is designed to protect actual victims, but its low barrier to entry makes it easy to abuse in civil disputes like this. It's a legal cheap shot, designed to throw the other person off balance and seize control. "Don't get mad, get organized," Hank advised. "You have 14 days. Use every single one." His words focused me. The shock turned into cold, methodical resolve. This was no longer just about getting my houseboat back. It was about exposing her lies in a court of law. I spent the rest of the day on the phone, lining up my witnesses. I called Earl Jensen, who agreed immediately to testify about seeing Karen and her friends move in, and about giving me the USB drive with the security footage. I called the marina maintenance guy, who remembered the old high-security lock on my gate and could testify that the new one was a cheap replacement. Then I called Susan McKay, the county clerk. She was more than willing to provide an official statement, on county letterhead, confirming that Karen's occupancy order was a complete fabrication with a forged seal and a bogus parcel number. Each phone call felt like loading another round into a magazine. I wasn't going to walk into that courtroom with just my story. I was going to walk in with an army of facts. I spent the next 2 days creating what I called my binder of truth. I printed everything, every email exchange with the HOA, high-resolution stills from the video footage, with the timestamp circled in red, the certified copy of my deed, Susan's official statement from the clerk's office, and a detailed, minute-by-minute timeline of events. I organized it all with neat little tabs. It was a simple, undeniable story told through paper. I felt a familiar sense of hope building inside me. No judge, I thought, could look at this binder of clear documented evidence and side with Karen's pack of lies. The day of the hearing arrived. The courtroom was small and sterile. I sat on one side, my binder on my lap. Karen sat on the other, flanked by Pete and Rick, who were there for moral support. She was dressed in a conservative blue suit, looking for all the world like a respectable community leader under attack. When our case was called, the judge, a tired-looking man who seemed to have seen it all, listened to Karen first. She gave a tearful, shaky performance about how she was just trying to enforce community safety rules when I had become aggressive and threatening. Then it was my turn. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get emotional. I simply opened my binder and calmly presented the facts, one by one. I showed him the forged document. I described the video evidence. I told him my witnesses were waiting outside. I thought I could see a flicker of understanding in the judge's eyes, but I was wrong. After I finished, He sighed and looked down at the stack of papers in front of him. "Mr. Rowan," he began, his voice flat and procedural, "you have presented some compelling information regarding the underlying property dispute. However, the purpose of this hearing is solely to address the request for a restraining order." He looked from me to Karen. Given the direct claims of threats, and in an abundance of caution for all parties involved, I am going to uphold the temporary order pending a full evidentiary hearing where we can hear testimony from all these witnesses. He looked at his calendar. "The court schedule is quite full. We can schedule that hearing for 2 weeks from today." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. Karen's face was a mask of smug victory. She had won. The system, in its cautious, plodding way, had handed her another 2 weeks. I walked out of that courthouse, not just locked out of my home, but a legal stranger to it. And Karen had 14 more days to play queen in my castle, with the full protection of the law. The drive back from the courthouse was the longest 15 minutes of my life. The judge's words echoed in my head: abundance of caution, pending review. They were neutral words, but they felt like a verdict against me. I had walked in with a binder full of undeniable truth, and walked out legally barred from my own home. Karen had won the battle, not with facts, but by skillfully playing the role of a damsel in distress. She had used the very system designed to protect people as a weapon to continue her occupation. For a few miles, I felt a heavy, crushing despair. It felt like punching a wall of pillows. All my force was being absorbed with no effect. But then, as I turned onto the familiar road leading back to the ranch, something shifted inside me. Hank's voice came back to me. "Don't get mad, get organized." I had tried to fight this quietly, through the proper channels, believing the facts would speak for themselves. I was wrong. The facts were only as powerful as the person willing to listen. And so far, I had been speaking in rooms where no one wanted to hear the full story. I realized Karen's power didn't come from the law. It came from the illusion of authority she projected onto the community. I had been fighting the illusion in a courthouse. It was time to fight it in public. My opportunity came 2 nights later. It was the HOA's regular monthly meeting, held in the community clubhouse. A flyer on the neighborhood bulletin board announced the agenda. Minutes from the last meeting, a budget review for new pet waste stations, and an open forum for resident concerns. It was perfect. I spent the afternoon preparing. I checked my state's law. It was a one-party consent state, meaning I could legally record any conversation I was a part of without telling anyone else. I slid a small digital voice recorder into my jacket pocket and made sure it was fully charged. I didn't bring my big binder of truth. That was for the courtroom. For this, I just needed the core evidence. I made clean copies of my deed, the statement from the county clerk about the forgery, and printed out a few high-quality, time-stamped stills from Earl's video footage. I tucked them into a simple folder. This wasn't about legal arguments. This was about showing my neighbors the truth in the plainest way possible. The clubhouse smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant. About 30 residents were scattered in folding chairs, most looking bored. At the front of the room, behind a long folding table, sat Karen, Pete, and Rick. Karen was in her element, tapping her gavel with an air of immense self-importance. She looked out at the assembled residents with a proprietary smile. I chose a seat in the back and just watched, my recorder capturing the low hum of conversation. They droned through the budget and the minutes. Finally, Karen announced it was time for the open forum, and before anyone else could raise their hand, she looked out at the crowd, her eyes scanning until they landed on me. A cruel, triumphant smirk flickered across her face. "Before we take questions," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "the board has a serious matter to announce regarding an abandoned vessel at one of the community-managed docks." A murmur went through the room. My jaw tightened. Due to unpaid fines totaling over $7,000 and the ongoing non-compliance of the registered owner, the board has voted to begin proceedings to auction the ranch houseboat to recover the community's losses. Gasps rippled through the audience. She was telling my neighbors that she was going to sell my home. She leaned into the microphone, her voice firm. "We cannot allow one individual's delinquency to become a burden on the entire community. This was my moment. I stood up, my heart hammering, but my voice came out calm and steady. "Excuse me, Karen." All heads turned toward me. Karen's smile tightened. "Mr. Rowan, you are out of order. And frankly, given the restraining order, your presence here is highly inappropriate." "I'm more than 100 yards away from you," I said, my voice carrying in the quiet room. "And I believe the residents deserve to hear the full story before you try to auction off property that doesn't belong to you or this HOA." I walked to the front of the room and placed my father's deed on the table in front of her. "This is the deed to the property you've been occupying. As you can see, it has never been part of this HOA. Next, I placed down the statement from Susan McKay. And this is a letter from the county clerk confirming that the occupancy order you used to justify your initial entry is a forgery. The seal is fake, and the parcel number belongs to a ditch by the highway." More whispers erupted. Pete and Rick were no longer smiling. They were staring down at the table, refusing to make eye contact. "And finally," I said, pulling out the printed stills from the video, "this is a picture of you, Pete, and Rick moving your personal belongings into my houseboat. Time-stamped for the same evening you sent out your fraudulent storm damage notice." I turned to face the residents. "They haven't been managing an abandoned vessel. They've been on a free vacation at my expense." The room was buzzing now. People were turning to each other, their faces a mixture of shock and anger. The foundation of Karen's power, built on whispers and flimsy paperwork, was crumbling before their eyes. She saw she was losing control. She let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound that was pure performance. "This is ridiculous," she declared, waving a dismissive hand at my evidence. "These are obvious fabrications from a disgruntled individual trying to avoid his financial responsibilities. This is a desperate stunt." But her words lacked conviction. The residents weren't looking at her with respect anymore. They were looking at her with suspicion. Just as she opened her mouth to continue, the heavy back door of the clubhouse swung open with a soft whoosh. The room fell silent as every head turned. Standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the evening light, was Deputy Mark Torres. He wasn't in a rush. He took a deliberate step into the room, his eyes scanning the crowd until they found Karen. In his right hand, he held a single, thick, manila envelope. He took another step forward, his gaze never leaving her face. The silence in the clubhouse was absolute. The air, which had been thick with Karen's lies and the residents' confused murmurs, was suddenly thin and cold. Deputy Mark Torres didn't rush. He walked slowly down the center aisle between the folding chairs, his footsteps the only sound in the room. His eyes were locked on Karen Whitmore. Her condescending smirk had vanished, replaced by a mask of pale, frozen shock. Pete and Rick, her loyal lieutenants, seemed to shrink in their chairs, suddenly very interested in the scuff marks on their shoes. Torres stopped directly in front of the head table. He didn't acknowledge me or anyone else. He was a man on a mission, and that mission had a single target. He laid the manila envelope on the table in front of Karen, the soft thud echoing in the quiet room. "Karen Whitmore," he said, his voice calm but carrying the full weight of the law. "It wasn't a question. It was a designation. I have a warrant for your arrest." A collective gasp swept through the room. Karen stared at him, her mouth opening and closing silently, like a fish out of water. "A warrant for what?" She finally managed to stammer, her voice a reedy whisper. "This is harassment. This is because of him," she said, pointing a trembling finger at me. Deputy Torres didn't even glance in my direction. He pulled a set of handcuffs from his belt. "The warrant is for fraud and filing a false police report," he said, his voice clear and precise for everyone to hear. "And another for unlawful occupancy. Please stand up and place your hands behind your back." The moment was surreal. The woman who had ruled this community with an iron fist, who had built her little empire on fake documents and baseless accusations, was being publicly dismantled. As she stood, a defeated, stunned look on her face, Deputy Torres secured the handcuffs. The sharp metallic click-click of the cuffs locking into place was the loudest sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of justice. It was the sound of her reign of manufactured authority coming to a definitive end. As Torres led her out of the room, she didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. She just stared at the floor, a disgraced president being escorted out like a common criminal. The moment the door closed behind them, the room erupted. One of the other board members, a quiet woman who had always seemed intimidated by Karen, immediately stood up. "I move for an emergency vote," she announced, her voice shaking but resolute. "I move to immediately remove Karen Whitmore as president of this association." Pete, seeing his own skin was on the line, was the first to second the motion. "All in favor?" the woman asked. A forest of hands shot up. It was unanimous. Pete and Rick voted her out as fast as everyone else. Her power had evaporated the second those handcuffs had clicked shut. The fallout was swift and clean. With Karen facing criminal charges, her entire house of cards collapsed. Her lawyer advised her to drop the restraining order against me immediately, and the document was voided by the court the very next morning. The fake $7,500 fine was, of course, erased from the HOA records. After a civil hearing that she didn't even contest, she was ordered to pay me for the damages. That included the cost of the high-security lock she'd had destroyed, and an additional $3,200 for the 2 weeks of unauthorized use of my property and utilities. The check arrived by mail a week later, a final, tangible admission of her defeat. The first thing I did when I got back possession of my houseboat was air it out, getting rid of that cheap floral scent and letting the clean lake breeze blow through. Then I went to work. I drove to a specialty locksmith and bought the best, most tamper-proof lock money could buy for the dock gate. I spent a Saturday afternoon installing it, the solid, heavy feel of the steel in my hands, feeling like I was restoring order to my little corner of the world. I also installed a new security camera, one with a better lens and a direct cloud backup, pointed right at the gate. It felt good to use my own skills to fix what had been broken, to build a better defense with steel and technology. It was a simple, powerful reminder of a lesson my father taught me long ago. Competence always beats control. And cameras, as Karen learned the hard way, don't lie. That evening, I finally had the moment I had been dreaming of since I first turned onto that dusty ranch road. I sat on the deck of my houseboat, a cold drink in my hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The water was calm, reflecting the fiery orange and purple sky. The world felt quiet, balanced, and mine again. I heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the dock and looked over to see my neighbor, Earl Jensen, walking toward me, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Thought you could use a proper coffee," he said, handing one to me. He didn't need to say anything else. We both knew what had transpired and what it meant. We sat there in comfortable silence, 2 neighbors watching the day end. The peace wasn't just the absence of conflict. It was something stronger, something that had been tested and had held. My sanctuary was safe, my community was stronger, and the quiet sunset over the lake had never looked so beautiful.